I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And welcome back to Rob and Nate Record a Podcast.
Episode number 5 for October 2021 theme month. Another selection of mine. 1955's The Night of the Hunter. Quite the film. First impressions.
Did you mix up which theme month we're doing?
It could have been a Christmas movie. I had forgotten.
You just showed me a Christmas movie.
Yeah, kinda. Though it doesn't become one until very late in the game.
Yeah. The twist at the end of this left me scratching my head a little bit. Maybe you can enlighten me a little.
And we may have to go back and around to that one because we've got...
I mean, it opens pretty well, but the last... at least third is a totally different movie.
It becomes a totally different movie, and when does it become a totally different movie?
Once they get found by the widow, or the... well, it's not clear if she's a widow. Once they're found on the bank.
I would say it happens earlier than that. It happens when they get onto the river to make their run.
Okay.
Because if you'll notice, in the earlier part of the film, it's played mostly realistic. Most of the exteriors are exteriors. It's filmed in the real world. It becomes very stagey after they get on the river, where you have a lot of forced perspective shots, and it gets more surreal as their journey goes. And this is a stupendous film, and you'll be surprised when I tell you this the second time I've seen it.
Okay.
I've been sitting on this DVD for a couple of years, figuring we were going to get to it eventually.
Okay.
First saw this movie in 2009. It made an impression. I mean, I bought the Criterion Collection DVD of it during sales month. But it's quite the story. It has to deal with, set in Depression-era West Virginia and on to Ohio. And it has to do with the two little children and their parents, Peter Graves and Shelley Winters. Peter Graves attempts a robbery, succeeds at a robbery, but he kills two people in the robbery, and he goes to prison, and he is executed. But before he is executed, he is cellmates with Robert Mitchum, who plays Harry Powell, who is a quote-unquote preacher, but he's a serial killer and a con man. And he realizes that there's this $10,000, which I went to the trusty inflation calculator online. I picked 1932, even though it doesn't say the exact year. But $10,000 in 1932 would be equivalent to about $200,000 today. So a sizable sum. And so the Reverend Powell, tracks down the widow, integrates himself into her life, basically convinces her to kind of fall for him. And then they get married. And then on the wedding night, wants nothing to do with her physically, much to her disappointment, and convinces her to basically channel that energy into kind of charismatic Christianity. And they go about preaching, and the whole time he's trying to win over these kids. The kids will tell him where Peter Graves hid the money, which is in the little girl's doll. And eventually the little boy keeps telling the mothers, like, he was just after the money, and when she figures out that might be true, he kills her and then pretends that she ran off. And then the kids take their dad's old skiff and they run down the Ohio River, eventually making landfall a couple times, but are eventually discovered by a kindly old woman played by silent screen star Lillian Gish, 1893 to 1993. And she takes them in, as she has taken in other young children. And, of course, Harry Powell has been pursuing them the whole way, and it leads to a final confrontation. A confrontation between good and evil, or if you'd like, the Old Testament and New Testament gods. This film is loaded with interesting imagery and symbolism. It very purposely invokes silent filmmaking. They even do that one shot of Robert Mitchum where it kind of goes down to the circular thing.
Oh, yeah.
Very silent.
Yeah.
And just the stylism of some of the sets, especially in the latter half of the film, and the heightened emotionalism that you get from that silent school of filmmaking, which is something that the director, who was the actor Charles Laughton, who we know from Witness for the Prosecution. This is the only film he ever directed. He directed on the stage quite a bit, but this was the only theatrical release he did. It is based on a 1952 novel in the Southern Gothic style by a man named Davis Grubb. And Grubb thought about adapting the screenplay, but he'd never adapted a screenplay before. So it was decided to bring in a man who had done that kind of work before, James Agee. James Agee was a prolific, very talented writer who worked in a lot of different genres, journalism, short story, screenplay. He also wrote The African Queen for John Huston a couple years earlier, which was an Oscar winner. And then he would win a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for his autobiographical novel, A Death in the Family, based on his boyhood in Knoxville, Tennessee in the 1920s. Mr. Agee would pass away 2 months before this movie was released of a heart attack. And Charles Laughton would pass away 7 years later in 1962. Not a success at the time of its release. It is now considered quite the classic, and I think quite deservedly so.
I can already tell you're higher on this movie than I am.
And excellent cinematography, as mentioned, by Stanley Cortez, who also did the cinematography for The Magnificent Ambersons, which was Orson Welles' follow-up film to Citizen Kane. And speaking of Citizen Kane, this movie has been likened thereunto by no less than the prestigious French film magazine, whose name I'm about to butcher, Cahiers du Cinéma, which in 2007 ranked it as the number 2 film of all time, surpassed only by Citizen Kane.
This one?
This one. I love it. I sense you don't.
I think that I might have enjoyed it more had it not been presented as a horror movie month.
Okay.
Because the part of this is, like, the opening, like, the start of this when the preacher comes and kills the wife and that type of stuff. There's some horror elements there, but this film really isn't that much of a horror film.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so, like, having it built in, or, inserted into horror month, especially by the end of the movie, I'm going, wait a minute, what am I watching in horror month? So
well, it's perhaps more of a thriller. It's perhaps more of a horror in an existential way, or, I mean, Harry Powell is a horrifying character.
Yeah.
He's as bad as any serial killer you've seen in film.
Yeah.
And he's just so slimy and charismatic, and he's got this weird sexual thing where which is weird because he murders people and he constantly lied, but he is a prude when it comes to sexuality. It's like he has this part of himself in the early sequence where he goes to the burlesque show that is really into it, but also hates himself for it more than he hates himself for killing.
Yeah.
Because as he says in one of his monologues to God while he's traveling, it's like, I know you're not against killing. Your book's full of killing.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. He is a terrifying character. But once he gets shot and then is arrested and the film keeps going, I'm like, wait a minute, where is this going? And then there's that also an existential moment where the mob's coming for him and the police have to rush him out the back, but that's not the focus of what's happening. It's it's Rochelle Cooper fleeing with the children from the town,
leading the children Mother Goose like, as she does several times,
back to the house, and
away from
and
all
then
the
it
chaos.
closes on a happy Christmas scene. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, it's kind of a little bit out of nowhere. It's very tonally.
Yeah, I was going to say tonally very different than what I was expecting for tonight.
One of the things that I enjoyed about the mob scene is the spoons, which were the ma and pa confectionaires from the small town that our main characters are from, who show up in the larger town for the murder trial and basically are at the head of this mob. They want to lynch the man. And she's become like drunk, which she'd never seen her before. Like, she's completely been disillusioned by who this guy turned out to be, because she was like his number one advocate. Yeah,
it's Icy Spoon and Walt Spoon, played by Evelyn Varden and Dawn Beto, respectively.
One of the things that Laughton wanted to do with this film, one of the themes he wanted to explore, was religion, obviously. Ironically, Laughton was on a tour of giving Bible readings. He gave an enthusiast, did multiple voices. He went on tour doing this around the time that this idea of making this book into a movie came about. And as in this film, he has very mixed feelings about religion. I mean, there's parts of this film that are, Rachel Cooper is a saint.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And she totally is a believer, and she's totally a practitioner. She lives it. Whereas Harry Powell, he can quote it.
Yeah.
And he's very much into the vengeance part of it. But the unruly mob and the religious frenzy. Charles Laughton was a lifelong closeted homosexual in a time where you could do hard time for acting on that, especially in Britain. And so he had this distrust of conservative religiosity, and he had this distrust of people being whipped up into a mob. And this film very effectively conveys that, though it is kind of all lumped towards the end of the film. But I love the relation. I love the kids. So the two kids in this film are played by Billy Chapin, John Harper, and Sally Jane Bruce as Pearl Harper. Sally Jane Bruce has a very distinctive look. She's only 5 years old when she made this film. She has an unusually prominent forehead that's very memorable. She went on to be an elementary school teacher. Billy Chapin went on to be a Marine.
Wow.
Yeah. And he really looks like he could be Peter Graves' son.
Yeah.
That's what really struck me in this film. It's like that casting, is really solid. And how the love he has of his dad.
And loyalty.
And how he does not warm up to another adult until Mrs. Cooper at the end.
Yeah.
That scene where he reaches out to touch her hand. It's the first time he's initiated any kind of contact with an adult. Uncle Bertie.
Bertie Steptoe.
Played by James Gleason, is another actor whose career dates back to the Silent Age, is this local widower who lives on the river and likes to spend time with the kids, take them out fishing. He's a good guy. In fact, he's the one that discovers
the body.
But
he's afraid to notify the police because he's afraid he's going to get framed for it or shut up.
So he's sitting that night in his houseboat, getting drunk, trying to work up the courage to report it, and he ultimately does, and he falls blackout drunk asleep. And he was the one that told the kids earlier, if you ever need help, come to me. He's no help at the time that they come to see him. And so they get on the boat, head down the river, which has those wonderful shots of the animals at the foreground, and it kind of goes into this fairy tale world. And the sets of, like, when they stop that first night, the house and the barn, they look like something out of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or German expressionistic filmmaking. The scene where they're up in the loft of the barn and they can see Powell on horseback singing his hymns as he does, looking for them. That effect was achieved by forced perspective. And so the Powell on the horse is actually a little person on a donkey.
That's funny.
I really do. This is an amazing film.
I recognize that it is beautiful. It's high quality. It is a good film. I just was thrown tonally expecting something different.
Yeah.
So
I guess that's the flip side of coming in basically blind.
Well, I'm still a little bit lost how this ended up being shown in a horror month.
Well, it's kind
not
of
that
loose.
I'm not trying to criticize.
I know it's kind of loose, and we've called it horror month. We've called it October Halloween theme month. I mean, we did the Muppets the Muppets Haunted Mansion, which isn't really a horror movie. Yeah, this is more of a horror movie than that is.
Fair enough.
It's it's existential horror. It's a thriller. It's fine drama. It's good versus evil. It's one of the most overt good versus evil films I can think of. It's also a big influence, I suspect, on David Lynch in terms of the stylism. At the very beginning of the film, where they have Miss Cooper and the children's faces in the field of stars, that is an effect that Lynch has returned to at least twice in his filming, probably 3 times now that I think about it. But also the stylized sets and the effects that are intentionally look fake to heighten certain stylistic reasons and to make it seem kind of unreal. I think this was a big influence on Lynch.
I was looking at some trivia on IMDb. Charles Laughton reportedly worked well with the boy playing John, but did not get along very well with the girl playing Pearl and shouted at her on occasion. As Laughton had the camera continue to roll after the scenes were finished, the camera often caught her reacting to him. Some of these outtakes were used in the final editing process as reaction shots to the preacher's character.
Well, one thing to that particular scene where she's visibly crying, and it's hard to get a 5-year-old to act cry, but you can get a 5-year-old to actually cry.
Yeah. Robert Mitchum was very eager for the part of the preacher. When he auditioned, a moment that particularly impressed Charles Laughton was when he described the character as a diabolical shit, and Mitchum promptly answered, "Present."
This is probably Mitchum's greatest performance.
Yeah.
And he was playing a little bit against type because Mitchum was kind of a film noir hero at this point, and he would always kind of play the unflappable guy who doesn't get worked up. Powell gets really worked up throughout this film.
Yeah.
And he gets pissed off and thrown off a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting film. It's easy to see why it would warrant some, inclusion in something like the Criterion Collection.
Mm. Oh, here's another one.
I do almost wish that my first viewing, again, especially after what we watched before this, I was expecting something different, and I almost wish my first viewing was under a different circumstance. But yeah.
You may have recognized a little song. There was a little fly that had a pretty wife. The pretty wife had 2 pretty little children. You've heard this song in the last year. Can you name the movie that you heard it in?
Not off the top of my head.
I'm assuming you've seen this movie. It is used in Promising Young Woman.
I haven't seen it.
Well, it's used in it.
Yeah.
And when they were playing it in that film, I was like, I know this. Where do I know this from? And when I was doing pre-research for tonight, I'm like, that's where I knew that from. The duet scene where Miss Cooper and Mr. Powell are both singing the same hymn.
Yeah. While she's holding
the shotgun to keep him at bay that night. It's the same scripture. It depends on how you use it.
Yeah.
This is the most profound part
Well,
of
same
this
thing
film.
with the song that they're singing at different times, and
and when Billy Chapin, the little boy, sees her with the Bible, and he kind of has this
and he
look.
steps outside at first.
Yeah, it's like, I don't like that book. That book is not associated with good things to me.
Exactly. His limited experience with it is hypocrisy and things, and you can see him shift when he comes back into the house, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, what is this? Yeah,
because she was telling a Bible story, and part of it resonated with him, and he was asking him about it. He is so good, Billy Chapin is in this.
Yeah.
He's so the older brother, and there's that scene early on after their father's been hung, and their mother's taken out of school because obviously
the kids have been taunting him,
and the kids are outside of the school, and they're singing this song about hanging, and him and the little girl are sitting there watching him. And you would expect in a movie that he'd go berserk and he'd hit some of these kids. He just holds it. He's sitting there. He's pissed off, but he's not going to act on it. Yeah. He's very disciplined young man.
And his scheming to get Harry Powell to go down into the cellar so he can lock him down there so they can make their escape. And...
He's smart, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, I'm not sure what the symbolism is on the watch, but at least that was a through line they introduced very early on. Just after the scene of the hanging song, where he looks kind of longingly at this watch in a store window, and that's what he gets for Christmas. It's just what he wants.
Yeah.
It symbolizes something to him. And yeah, it's such a nice resolution. We haven't talked about Ruby, the troublesome girl. Who's how old is Ruby? 13?
I would say 14,
14?
something like that. Yeah, played by Gloria Castillo.
She is the oldest of Miss Cooper's
Brood of
charges
orphans or whatever.
And you were looking for love, Ruby, in the only foolish way you knew how. And this is just younger boys, and then when the preacher takes an interest in her to pump her for information about the runaways.
As we learn later.
And she just spills the beans to him because this is a man
who's shown
paying
her
attention.
What seems like genuine affection, not just physical attraction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sad. And another thing that's sad is, and they never really get into this, and maybe it's addressed more in the novel, whatever it is that separated Miss Cooper from her son. Because she talks about, I've lost my son's affection.
For a couple minutes there, I wondered if it wasn't Harry Powell.
Hmm.
Like when he first comes back to the house, I'm like, okay, is this the son returning home?
Yeah.
Yeah. But he's like just perverted what she's raised him in or something,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah. So I had a moment of like, oh crap, is that what that is? And she's going to let him into the house because he's the son.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
You know what that portrayal also reminds me of? We posted a recent episode on it. Billy Bob Thornton in season 1 of Fargo.
Oh yeah.
He's this malevolent force that came out of nowhere. We don't know his backstory, but he's serious about killing and scheming and getting his way, and he's got a very particular moral code of sorts.
Yeah.
But anyway, I love this movie. I'm giving this movie 4 stars out of 4. I'm giving it 10 out of 10.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm torn where to let it land on the 4-star scale because I'm going to give it 8 out of 10 on the 10-star scale. So I guess that puts it kind of right in that 3.5-star range on the 4-star scale.
Well, maybe you'll have to sit on this one and revisit it at some point.
I would like to. Yeah, I think you could have presented this as a Christmas movie, and it would work just as well.
Yeah, you could have argued at the end. It's like it was a Christmas movie at the end, but it was really more of a horror movie.
True. I don't know. We could have watched it numerous times, and yeah.
Well, I'm glad I finally found a way to work it in.
Yeah.
And I just kind of thought that it fit as a companion piece stylistically with Carnival of Souls.
Yeah.
Very heightened.
Yeah.
Black and white.
Stylistically, I can absolutely see that, yeah. Interesting dichotomy in films.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, that's really all I have to say about it.
Okay. Well, I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. Yeah, I just got thrown tonally. I don't know if you caught that. Like, at the end of the movie, I literally was like, wait a minute, how's this going to connect?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could say that might be one of the flaws of the film is it does, that last part is so different than everything that came before.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I have a feeling that no matter when you watched it, that huge shift is going to be like, oh, wait, yeah.
Yeah. But it'd be interesting to analyze, I don't know, screen time. But, Robert Mitchum isn't in the end of the film that much. He's eclipsed by Mrs. Cooper.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and so, I mean, it's not clear. Was he sentenced to death?
Does he get out of town? I know they leave that kind of ambiguous. Because the mob is on its way, and we don't know for certain if the police succeed and get him out.
Well, but if he was scheduled to be executed, I don't know. But it's not clear if he was actually sentenced to death because
the boy wouldn't
identify him, wouldn't look at him and identify him.
That was interesting at the end when the cops got him. They got him down on the ground, and it evokes the same thing that happened to the biological father at the beginning of the film, and that breaks the little boy. It's like, no, stop it. He can't stand to see that because it reminds him of his own father.
Yeah,
and that's all this time keeping the money and keeping the doll where it had been stashed, and then he just literally throws the money on the man as he's being handcuffed. So he does kind of get what he was after at the very end.
Yeah.
Not that it does him any good.
Yeah. Well, and I presume that's when he decides to fully trust Miss Cooper and give her money. And
because he feels that guilt about the money that his mother always claimed to have early on, saying, "I need to know what happened to the money so that he knows, so that everybody knows that I don't have it,
yeah,
and that I don't want it." And this was this thing that his father had entrusted him with, and did everything to protect it until it finally got to the point where he legitimately didn't want it anymore.
yeah. Well, yeah, that's a fun film.
Oh.
I am glad that I saw that. But yeah.
Had you even heard of it?
No. It was not rated.
No.
Yeah.
1955.
Yeah.
Again, didn't do good business at the time. Didn't cost a ton to make, from what I've read. So
Looks like here it says $795,000 budget. That can't be right.
can't
A
be
worldwide
right.
gross of
Yeah.
2,000. Yeah.
yeah, it's not right. It lost money, but I don't know how much
Yeah.
money it lost at the time.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I didn't intend to do this, but I ended up kind of doing a theme. I was thinking about this, and I did a theme last year as well, for my Halloween selections. So last year's theme would have been Corman-esque, because we had Targets, we had Chapin Mall, and we had the Slumber Party Massacre, all Corman-esque exploitation movies. This year's theme, Artie Black and White. Not what you think of when you think of a Halloween theme.
Yeah. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
And here we are, 11 o'clock at night.
11 o'clock at night, as I'm yelling from your loft.
That's going to be an outtake for Jackson. Anyways, keep going. Sorry.